Kristen Cox is going to be talking to us, about their what they do and what they're doing and what the experience is and how we can be successful in live ops. So hopefully Kristen will join us shortly. Here we go. Hey, Kristen, how are we doing? Oh, you're on mute at the moment.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, great. Hello, how are you doing, Oscar?
Not too bad, not too bad. Glad to have you here. And again, thanks again for the support you guys give us in sponsorship. Now, I'm a little bit earlier, but hope that just means that you get more time for questions later.
Yes.
So I'm gonna, if that's all right with you, I'll pass over to you.
Absolutely, and I'm gonna start screen sharing.
Right. Yeah.
Yay, there it is. Yeah, no, this has been really fun. This has been great watching the show so far. You guys have done a fantastic job sort of transitioning to this digital format. But today I am here to talk to you guys about live ops readiness. So this is going to be, I think, pretty breezy. Hopefully we will have some time for questions at the end. I'm just going to talk about 10 things, like the big 10 things to think about when you're getting ready to do live ops. To start though, I'm going to say a little bit about me. So I'm Kristen Cox. I'm the director of live operations for the Xbox Game Studios Publishing Group. I've been with Xbox for about 18 months now, but I've been making games for 17 years, pretty much exclusively live games. I've done a lot of MMOs and a lot of like live connected games sort of in the larger AAA, AA space. Right now, though, a lot of my job is working with teams who are going to do live ops maybe for the first time, or they're just really expanding their use of live ops in a way that they never have before. So I'm working with a lot of teams who are getting ready to really do live ops. And a lot of those teams are not new to games, but they are new to live ops, which I think is a pretty normal place for a lot of teams to be. Some teams do come up into live ops sort of right away. It's the first thing they do, but a lot of teams are making games and then start adding in live ops. So as I've been working with these teams, it's helped me sort of encapsulate across the board what it is to do live ops. They have a lot of questions like, what do I really need to do? What do I really need to know? And so I put together just a quick sort of listicle, like it's, the 10 things you really need to have nailed down as you get into live ops. So I'm just going to run through those and hopefully it'll also help you if you're in a similar situation, or even if you've been doing live ops for a long time, sometimes it's good to just get a nice refresher. So these are the 10 things that I think if your team can really ask these questions of yourselves and have good answers, you should be very well situated to have success in live ops. So we'll start with number one, and number one is retention, which shouldn't be too shocking. Retention should really be at the heart of any live ops game. What you really want to ask yourself is, how are you going to keep players in the game long term? So this is a question that's mostly about game design, and it really should be asked fairly early in game. Hopefully, if you're making a live ops game, retention is at the heart of your game loop, the heart of what the game itself actually is. But even if you know going in from the beginning, I'm going to make a live ops game, it's worth stopping and just asking this relatively simple question: what exactly is going to keep players in the game long term? Because for a live op game to really thrive, you are going to have to retain for the long term. It's much more difficult to keep a live ops game going if your game has sort of a very distinctive beginning, middle, and end, and it takes, on average, 8 to 10 hours in order to complete the experience. Obviously, for a live ops game, you want something that players can continually engage in. That can mean a lot of things. The answer to this question could be anything from progression and growth mechanics, which is the most traditional answer. It could be novelty. You could say we're going to have new experiences over and over and over again. We're just going to keep adding them, and that's the thing that's going to keep people in long term. The important thing is that you have an answer to this question. What is your retention strategy? How are you going to keep players playing? So that's the first one, retention, followed pretty closely by number two, monetization. If you're making a live ops game, you really do have to ask yourself, how are we going to make money? Because very few live ops games use the most simple sort of monetization strategy in games, which is make a game, completely finish it, package it up, and then have the player pay one flat fee for it before they play the game, which is just sort of buy to play, classic retail style monetization strategy. That's actually pretty rare for a live ops game. So you're going to have to think a little bit more deeply and ask the question, how exactly are we going to make money? You should have a clear answer to this. You know, I know that sometimes it's nice to think like, as a creative, well, we're just gonna make a great game and then somehow the money will come. But that's rarely the way it really works. So it's good to sit down and really have this conversation with yourself. It's also incredibly, even more important if you're gonna have a live game, because usually you are going to need to have revenue flowing in order to continue to operate your game. Since live games rely on being continually updated, it's unlikely that you're going to finish the game and then have less need for support and staff and all the things that it takes to keep the game going. So you really are gonna have to think, how is money gonna flow in? How confident are we in the money flowing in? What rate do we think it's going to come in? What is our strategy for monetization? After that, we go into social. To me, this is an incredibly important question to ask. How will your players interact with each other? And I think that even if you're making a game that's strictly single player, even if you're making a game that's a super simple match 3 single player game, you still want to ask the question, how are your players going to interact with each other, even if you're making the decision that that interaction is going to be primarily completely outside of the game, on third-party platforms, and even if you're not going to take a strong hand in it. And that's because live ops games really thrive on players' abilities to invest in your game. And so much of that investment comes down to the ability for players to talk to other players about their experience in the game and to form those kind of social bonds. I highly recommend that any team making a live ops game of any kind ask this question, even if you think you know that the answer is, oh, we're not doing anything social. Consider if maybe you should be doing something at least a little bit social, or you should be accounting for how players are going to interact with each other, because you need to have a plan for that. Like, even if it's very basic, even if it's just, we're going to start an official Discord channel, doing that ahead of time and really knowing what you're going to be getting into and having an understanding and a mapping of how players are going to talk to each other and how they're going to interact with each other is key. Now, a lot of games will have very detailed social interactions inside of the game. And so if you are making a game that's heavily reliant on social, this is also a good time to stop and ask, what exactly are the mechanics we're going to be using to do that? Do we have actual social features inside of the game? How are we putting them together? What's the UX for that? Very frequently, I see developers make games that are inherently very, very social, but not prioritize creating social features. Those like get to the bottom of the list, or they're not even considered, or, you know, they don't even realize they might need to go and build something to facilitate that social interaction and make sure that it happens cleanly. And then that can cause you a lot of trouble down the road if you're not getting the kind of attach and you're not getting the kind of retention you expect from a very social game, because you haven't really built the systems to facilitate that social interaction. So super key, how will your players interact with each other? Next, we get into something a little bit more technical, networking and backend tech. So how is your game going to be connected, and how are you going to scale online? Today, this is basically something that every team really has to contend with. It's very rare nowadays for any game, even ones that are very light on live ops, to have absolutely zero backend or zero networking to contend with. So make sure, even if you're a very, very small team, that you're asking this question, how exactly are we going to be connecting? How are we going to scale? For very small teams, you might be like, well, I just assume that the platform is going to handle that, right? Like, I'm going to be on Apple, I'm going to be on Android. That's going to take care of most of what I'm doing. But make sure you really investigate that and look to see if it's really going to take care of all of your needs. You know, if you don't have an engineer, a networking engineer on your team, consider sort of like reaching out to the community and getting advice to try to figure out what exactly you should be looking at, even if it's not a major component of your live ops game. And a lot of that is because games, you know, this has been going on for 30 years now. Live games have had trouble with scale. You know, I always tell teams, make sure you plan for success, because one of the worst situations is to have your game fail because too many people showed up to play it. That's a situation nobody really wants to be in. You want to be able to capitalize on success. So you really want to be thinking, what are we going to do if a lot of people show up. And that's both just in raw power, which, to be fair, these days is actually much easier, right? We have access to lots of very powerful cloud networks that allow us, games to scale organically, dynamically. You don't have to worry about provisioning servers anymore. But you need to think about that side of it, but you also need to think about the way your game actually works. So is it going to be a good experience if suddenly there are 1 million, 10 million people playing your game? Is that going to overwhelm the way you're doing matchmaking? Is that going to overwhelm the way you're handling lobbies or the way that you're handling the ability for players to connect to each other? Is that going to change the balance of your game? Is it going to make it harder for people to join up into groups? Is your guild system going to work? All of these things are things you should be asking yourself. How is the game going to scale? What's going to happen when I'm connected and all these people are playing? Next, once you have that connection, what is your live content strategy? So how are you going to add content to the game? Pretty much every live ops game relies on some form of content strategy, whether that's balance, in a competitive PvP game, and maybe, new modes or maps, or if it's an RPG and you're adding in tons of quest content and land and classes and all these things. Pretty much all kinds of live ops games must have some form of content strategy. So you need to ask yourself, how are you going to add content to the game? On what cadence are you going to add it? What kind of content? I really recommend the teams actually sit down and write this out well ahead of launching and really ask themselves, what is their strategy going to be? Why are they choosing that strategy? How do they think it's going to work? What kind of results do they think they're going to get if they do this kind of content update frequency, if they do this kind of content being updated, and really lay that down. Even if when you launch the game, you find out a lot of your assumptions were incorrect, it's so much easier to figure that out if you go in really knowing exactly what those assumptions are and what you expect to get, and then be able to compare what you're actually getting to your expectations, as opposed to just going live, trying some things out, and then trying to sort through the data later. So highly recommend really ask yourself, what are you going to be doing for your live content strategy? Married along with that is the next one, number 6, which is content management tools. So if you're going to be putting all of this content into your game, you probably need to figure out how you're going to manage it. This is something that the games industry has really struggled with, because traditional game development that's sort of done as, fire and forget, or, box product style games, is really built around the idea of building tools to get to the finish line. It's the idea of like, we need to build these tools so we can finish the game, so we can, completely get down to, work through our bug queue, have a final gold master, and then put it out the door. Even though we've been doing live ops for a very, very long time, we still oftentimes don't have fantastic tools. And if you're using off-the-shelf solutions, especially for your engine, you may not realize that if you want to build live content management tools, you're probably going to either have to do it yourself, or you're going to have to go out and get a second set of middleware to do that content management. And when I say content management, I mean everything from the pipeline for putting content out into the world, to the way you're going to visualize that content. Like, for instance, if you do have a competitive PvP game and you plan to be making balance changes all the time, do you have an easy way for your designers to actually see all the numbers in the game and make quick changes to it and then test those changes in a way that isn't incredibly time consuming? Do you have a system for making changes to the game without pushing new client versions? Do you have a way to manage your backend configurations on the server side? All of those things are tools that oftentimes get deprioritized, honestly, by teams, because it's really hard to build the game to begin with. So we're really focused on that and not so focused on how we're going to manage all this content when it's out in the world. So definitely take time to think about management tools, content management tools. 7, this is a subset sort of 6, so the build, test, deploy pipeline, because in a lot of ways, build, test, deploy is one of those content management tools. But how are you going to release changes and content to the players? Build, test, deploy, or build, deploy is really the backbone of making iterative updates into your game. And it's one of the things that I think teams should spend a lot of time thinking about, even when they're early on in development. The faster you can get a build pipeline that is iterative and flexible and start using it even before you launch, the better off you're going to be when you go live. Because when you're live, the backbone of your game, like really the sink or swim for a live ops game, is going to be how quickly and how easily you can iterate on your game. So you really need to have a fantastic plan for how are you going to make changes to the game. Now, I think we still tend to call these build pipelines, even though nowadays this doesn't necessarily mean that you are relying on a strategy that requires you to push lots of builds or lots of versions of the game to the player. Your build, test, deploy pipeline may be almost entirely on the server side, and maybe almost entirely supported by bits and bytes in the cloud, as opposed to actually pushing them onto your player's device. Even so, you need to make sure that pipeline is working really well and that it has the ability to do things like roll back in case you put something out that you really, really need to take back because it's causing a huge problem in your game, and that you have the ability to do staging, that you have the ability to do a lot of testing on all of your changes that are being pushed out before they hit your players, and that you have the ability to do multi-threaded development so that if you are in fact doing lots and lots of updates, you can have your team working on multiple versions of the game at once, but still be able to safely deploy just one set of changes without touching the other one. So those are all really important things to think about. And as I said, highly recommend that your team actually gets a system completely in place and you actually start working this well before you actually launch the game. Next, analytics and data. So, if you get your game, it's got great retention, social features, you have a strategy for putting content into it, you have a strategy for releasing all this content, you have a backend, all these things, then you actually need to understand what is happening in that game so that you can make intelligent decisions about making those changes. Because you can have a fantastic content strategy and a good set of tools and a good build pipeline, but if you don't know what you're doing to the game, you're going to be lost. So you need to ask, how are you going to track and analyze player behavior? What is the data you're going to be collecting? And what are you going to do with it? What system are you going to use to collect that data? So that's tools, right? And storage, data flow, all of those things need to be accounted for. But this is also about policy. I'm a big believer in the philosophy that you should only collect what you're going to do something with. I don't believe in collecting data that you don't have a use for. You should be very deliberate, in my opinion, on what you collect. Have an actual plan. What data are you collecting and what are you going to do with it? How are you going to look at it? How are you going to evaluate it? I strongly recommend for my teams that they put together a written strategy for data before we launch that has a set of goals and targets for everything that we're going to be tracking. And if we have no goal for that data, then we have to really ask ourselves, why are we tracking this? It's true that you could get into a situation in the future where you wish you had data, you have a new need, and you wish that you had old data, but that's actually more rare than you might imagine. And a lot of times you can address that by getting the data moving forward. To me, that is the lesser of the evils of collecting lots and lots of data and drowning in it, having a hard time managing it and not knowing what to do with it. I would rather be in the situation of saying, oh, I just realized I have a new bit of data I want to start collecting, than be in a situation where I'm not able to make efficient use of my data because I don't really know how to manage it or regulate because there's so much of it and I don't even really know what I'm looking for or what it means. So this is also about process. Ask your team, how are we going to collect data? On what frequency are we going to analyze the data? What are we going to do to analyze the data? How long are we going to store our data? And then how often are we going to act on our data? Even if this ends up changing quite a lot after you go live, and it probably will because you're going to get to know your game a lot better and you're going to get to know what does and doesn't work, it's really worthwhile to have done this work before you launch so that you go in confidently and you're not sort of in a post-launch state of panic, trying to figure out what are we doing, what do these numbers mean. So really sit down and think about what are you going to do to track player behavior and why are you going to do it? And then what are the actions you're going to take based on that data? And you're going to be doing a lot better and you'll start to move a lot more quickly after you get out. So many games these days do a soft launch and spend some time sort of in limited markets. And the key to sort of getting through that stage really quickly and efficiently is having a really strong understanding of what you're going to do with the data, how you're going to collect it, and then how you're going to optimize to get to the next step. And that moves us to a specific kind of data monitoring, which is live monitoring. So how are you going to monitor your game's performance? This is a subset of data and analytics, but it's a really specific one. So every live game is going to need some type of monitoring, even if it's all the way over on the end of the spectrum where your monitoring is, if a player writes a bad review on, the platform, I will know there's a problem, all the way to we have an entire team of people who do nothing but have a 24-hour on-call schedule to make sure that all of our services are up and running. Think about where you want to follow that continuum. And I would say really think about it. I think it's sort of something that a lot of live teams go, obviously I want 24/7, knock support, and I want on-call trees, and I want everybody looking at it all the time. But I would say, especially for smaller teams, really examine whether or not that's going to be necessary for you, and also what you can actually maintain for your game. It is true that every live game is going to have some amount of monitoring that needs to happen. And there's going to be some amount of services that at some point will fall over. Someone, whether it's on a local level of a single player or an entire outage, will happen. So you do need to have a plan for what you're going to do when that happens. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you need an army of people to be monitoring your game. So really think about what is going to work for your game at your scale. Finally, we get to number 10, which is community. So to me, the backbone of live ops games is community. Really, having a live ops game to me is all about growing and shaping a community, because that's what really creates stickiness. When you are launching your game, I strongly urge teams to think deliberately, how are you going to grow and shape your community? This is a space where developers, I think, have a lot more influence than they usually think they do. If you have a deliberate plan for how you want your community to grow, what kind of community you want to have, you can take deliberate steps to set norms, put policies in place, figure out what kind of monitoring you want to do, all of those things before the game goes live, and then you can have a lot more control about shaping your community. I'm not saying that it can be perfect or you can prevent all kinds of negative or toxic behavior, but you can have a greater hand in it than you might realize. And it also gives you a leg up to start using organic growth. We spend a lot of time in live ops thinking about acquisition. And when we think about acquisition, we usually think about paid acquisition. But please don't completely ignore organic growth. It can be incredibly powerful, and it will deliver you some of your most devoted fans. So spend some time before you launch thinking about your community, where it's going to live, how it's going to be grown, and how it's going to be shaped. So those are my 10 things. If this can hopefully be helpful to you, if you can really sit down with your team and go over these, even if you think, yes, of course we have answers for most of these, I still think it's a worthwhile exercise to really look at all of these, because if you can have fantastic answers to these questions and good plans, you really are going to be in a great state for live ops. I mean, if you're doing all of these things at a sophisticated level, you're basically a live ops master at that point, because these are the things that are going to be coming up over and over and over again for you. So that's the checklist. Really quickly, if you'll indulge me for a tiny little plug, I have a podcast that I co-host called The Art of Live Ops. So if you like listening to developers talk about live ops, this is a podcast that I host with James Gertzwin. We interview in every episode a different live ops developer and talk to them about their experience in live ops and their experience making live ops games. The first season is completely out. There's like 18 episodes. We're going to have new episodes starting to land in July. So check it out, The Art of Live Ops. Okay.
That sounds fantastic. I'm going to have to go and subscribe to that immediately. Anyway, that was fantastic, Chris. Nice, simple 10 points. I could not even question any one of them. Not even the priority of them. I mean, I could spend hours debating with you about how to structure data as well, but that's just anyway. We have a question. We've probably got loads of questions that will come out. Let's start off with the one again. This is from anonymous attendee, the very popular question maker.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think indie developers are too worried about user acquisition and retention from the data and cost point of view, and are not taking enough advantage of fandom and community that can push them forward for free?
I mean, yes. It's a good question. I do hear a lot, especially from small teams now, that they're kind of being overwhelmed with this idea of games as a service, right? That there's this idea that it's this big thing, it's expensive, that you need to have a data scientist, and they need to be in there doing these. And those things can be fantastic, and you'll hear great stories from teams like Teams at King and Supercell that have done amazing things with systems like that. So that's fantastic. But if you're a small team, I think it's still true that grassroots is one of the best investments that you can make. And when you see teams that do sort of rise up above the noise, because that is really what we're fighting against at this point, there's so much content that you want to get noticed. And really, your chances as an indie of getting noticed by trying to yell louder than everyone else is pretty low. So you want to take that kind of grassroots approach and sort of try to come in with your players, like build that fan base and get them to evangelize you.
Yeah, if someone wrote a book about games as a service. Oh, wait, I did. No, but I mean, I'm joking, but it's like, yeah, absolutely, that's the key point, isn't it? And it's like, why shout across the room when you can go up to somebody? And we're spending a lot of our time shouting and spending lots of money. And that's nothing. I mean, I am not trying to say that the publishing side is a bad thing at all. Far from it. It's amazing and it's really good and it's really specialist skills. But focusing on only UA and marketing is not going to get you the retention.
Yeah, it's very unlikely. Yeah, I think I agree. Like, it's very unlikely. The truth is also that when we look at the most successful live ops games, you still see that they're all very focused on communities. Yeah. They're very focused on people having passionate investment in the game. And that generally doesn't come from people like seeing an ad. That might be the beginning, but also what could be the beginning is literally talking to you, the developer, on a Discord channel.
No, absolutely. And actually, I think, the thing I think is hard for a lot of designers in particular to do is to realize that they're giving up their baby to a certain extent. Because it's not their game anymore. I mean,
it really isn't. I mean, that is hard, right? Rod Chang, who's a fantastic live ops developer who works for Microsoft Asia, made an analogy that I love. He said that traditionally in the West, when games are coming up, game developers and designers wanted to be movie directors, but in live ops, you want to be a nightclub manager, and that's a really different mentality.
That is actually, I wish I thought of that one. That's a great line.
I know, it's so good. It's Rod is.
It sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's also, part of that is being it's being the retailer. It's making sure that you've got the staff, the entertainment, you've got the VIP section. There's so many elements of that metaphor that just match.
Yeah. And your job is really to make sure to create a space and an opportunity for people to have a fantastic time. Exactly. And I love it because it really is true that sometimes it can feel in live ops like, well, what are we doing? We're just building tools for players to make their own fun. Like, who am I as a designer? And it's like, well, I can never have an experience in my home that's the same as going to an incredibly, well-produced nightclub. That's not something that I'm capable of. You're giving me that possibility.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We have another question here. So until not long ago, developers thought only about releasing the game and not about the longevity of the game. Oh, I totally agree with this. Live ops seems to be a new thing. That I don't agree with. Yeah. I've been doing it for 22 years, so I'm a bit biased. That should be thought of from the beginning. For teams that have only just realized their need for live ops, what is the most important thing to start with? We already know your top 10, but if you were to start with kind of one way of thinking, what would it be?
So I'm going to go very meta on this. And I would say that the first thing you want to do is it's at the team culture level. Really, I would say the first job that you have when you're moving to live ops is to get your team to embrace iteration. Embrace the idea of never done. Embrace the idea of never perfect. Embrace the idea of getting it out there even when you're scared and iterating on it. It's hard, but you got to get the team in that mentality. In a lot of ways, it ends up being really break out of that waterfall world.
Yeah.
Because it can't be that way anymore.
the one thing I think for me, it's actually about thinking about pipelines. And what I mean by that is, it's like you've got to create a sense. In fact, I'm gonna go fully Columbo on you. It's the Columbo TV show.
Yes.
And I know that's a stupid thing, but anyone who's heard me speak has probably told me mention Columbo, and it's the best TV show in the world because you know what to expect. It's a whodunit where you know who did it, so you know what to expect, and yet you still watch it.
Right.
Because you're filling in the gaps and trying to predict what's coming before he says, just at the end, just one more thing.
Right.
If we can set up that every week feels like a Columbo moment where they're looking forward to what it is that's going to come next and they want to predict it before we say just one more thing, then I think we've absolutely nailed live ops.
I love that idea because it really is, that's a dialogue with your players, right? It's not about just creating something interesting. It's like you said, it's about playing with the expectation of inviting them in to say, I want you to guess. I want you to be involved in the process of anticipating what it is I'm going to do. Sometimes I want you to be surprised. Sometimes I want you to be satisfied because you did guess it correctly. And that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. And I think that's it for us at the moment. So that was amazing. Thank you so much for that. I will have to find out the name of that person who came up with the nightclub quote, because I am going to steal that.
Absolutely. Yes.
On my next webinar, I'm sure. So Kristen, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Thank you guys.
Absolute pleasure.